All right, welcome to Ames Public Library virtually for Genealogy Plus, a program brought to you through a partnership with Ames Public Library and the Story County Genealogical Society. Today's presentation is Adding Stories to Your Family Genealogy with our speaker, Patricia Coffie. I have just a few housekeeping notes. We have muted your microphones for the presentation, so please submit any questions or comments via the chat function, which you should find a link to at the bottom of your screen. I will be monitoring the chat to make sure that your questions get shared with our speaker, and we will reserve some time at the end for questions. Today's session is being recorded, and it will be posted to the Ames Public Library's YouTube channel. If you get bumped out of the meeting today, just follow the original link back and you'll be able to get right back in. And I have also placed a link to the Genealogy Plus page of the APL website. There you can find this year's Genealogy Plus brochure. So this is the final presentation for this season of Genealogy Plus. And you'll also find the handout for this presentation on the right side of that page. I've also posted a link to that in the chat directly. So with that, I will pass the microphone to Patricia.
Thank you, Megan. I put this together on Keynote, and I hope that won't be too boring. What I want to do is tell you a story so that you'll know I have done some of this. And I had Aunt Maxine on my father's side of the family, Susan and cousin Jim on my mother's side of the family, and they did those enormous charts, names and dates and places. Susan brought hers to one of the family reunions. It took the whole side of the garage to tape it up. So that's been done and done well. They've added pictures. It's got all the names and dates and places. And I began to tell the stories that go with those names and dates. You can add stories, and if you get started and you want some help, or there's something I can help you review, I'd be glad to do it. There's my email, maymod@mac.com. That's my first mother-in-law's name, May, and my grandmother's middle name, Maud, because if anyone could have handled the transition to email, would have been those two. Now, it just jumped out of play.
It looks like you might be at the end of the presentation. So if you scroll back up on the, on that side, and click on,
yes.
And then hit play. And then you should be able to use your arrow keys.
Oh, Megan, you are so patient. Why should you do this? Well, every time I tell a story, add a story, share a story with family, I get comments like, I love the stories. And our stories tell us who we are. What was that name associated with? Stories connect us to one another, to life, to right now, and to history. Remember when we sent letters and we talked about something and everything and nothing at all? Well, that's what the stories do for us. So here are some pictures of my mom and dad. My mom is 17, my dad is 19. Those are their high school graduation pictures. The other picture of the two of them is the day after their wedding, 10 years later. Now I'm going to stop the pictures. All right. I had gone to the big family reunions, and this was in the time before paper plates. And so at family reunions, when 50 to 100 people came together and spent the whole day, girls spent some time in the kitchen cleaning up. This was where the moms and the aunts and the grandmas shared the real stories, the stories of birth and death and all of the things in between. But you know, I was a little kid and I was way too busy for that stuff. So I didn't pay much attention. but I did know those stories were being told. And then I was 22. It just seemed like the blink of an eye. And I was going to become a mother myself in only a few more months. So I went back to my mother and I said, Mom, tell me again about the day I was born. And my mother said, well, you know, in 1939, you didn't go running off to the hospital every 5 minutes. You were supposed to take care of things yourself. But it was my first child and I was really nervous. So I had your sister in the hospital. And when it was over, I said, well, if that's all there is to it, I'll just have the rest of them at home. And so you were born at home. We were there on Dean in that Drake area in Des Moines. And upstairs with me was your father. He was on my right, and Lavona, my cousin, was on my left. Now, you probably don't remember Lavona because, of course, this is from the time when we taught our children manners, and you would never address your elder by their first name. We thought of a title for you to use. And of course, on the day you were born, you weren't calling her anything. But eventually, she would watch you kids while I had the next baby. And we decided you would call her Mama Tony. Do you remember Mama Tony? I said, why, yes, I do. I remember seeing her silhouetted in the doorway at her house, trying to get her parrot to go back in its cage. I remember Mama Tony. Well, Mom said, Bergeson was upstairs with me. Now, you know, Dr. Bergeson, Redfield, and Schlager had just opened their practice together. Redfield was downstairs playing the piano in the living room. I don't know where Schlager was, but do you remember Bergeson, Redfield, and Schlager? They were your doctors clear through college. Yes, I said, I remember. Well, Mom said, the only other person who was there was your grandma, my mom, and she was a nervous wreck. Now, she'd had all 8 of her babies at home and done just fine, but when you have your baby at home, someone else takes that newborn, washes them off, polishes them up, puts them in a diaper and a little nightgown, wraps them in a neat little blanket and brings them back to you. You would be the first minutes old baby for which she would be responsible. And she was a nervous wreck. She went down, she took the dining room table, she put every leaf there was in it. Then she covered the whole thing with bath towels, put that little basin right in the middle. She figured if you flipped over and made a break for it, she'd have time to run around the table and catch you. Well, in the meantime, upstairs, pretty soon there you were, and Dr. Bergeson held you up like this, and he said, 7 pounds, Gert. We're going to call it 7 pounds. And I said, fine. Now he clipped the cord, wrapped you in a little blanket, and handed you to your father. And your father was dumbstruck. Now he was a farm boy. He knew about birth and life and all. And you were not his first child, but you were the first one he saw take that very first breath. He was dumbstruck. He looked at you for a couple of minutes and then passed you over to me and said, Patricia Rose, that's what we'll call her. Now, Lavona and I, we opened up that blanket and counted fingers and toes and ears and nose and that sort of thing, and discussed how cute it was that you had this little roll of fat around your neck. You know, you were not my largest baby, but you were the only one born with that roll of fat around your neck. And then we gave you back to your father. Your father took you down to your grandmother. She polished you up something wonderful and evidently behaved pretty well, because pretty soon your father brought you back and gave you to me. And that's the story of how you were born. And I thought, wow, what a welcome into love and life and family. And I told my friends about that day. And one of my friends, evidently not so welcomed, said, well, if that story is true, was your father on your mother's right looking up from the foot of the bed or down from the head of the bed? And just what song was that other doctor playing? I went back to my mother. I asked, and my mother said, this hand, my right hand, this hand right here is the one your father was holding, and Lavona was holding my left hand. And I don't know what the name of that song was, but I know it had a pretty good beat. It went something like push 2, 3, 4, push 2, 3, 4. And that was that. Now, the years went by and the months went by, and my first son was born. Now, I had Dan in the hospital because just as you were expected to have your children at home in the 1930s and 40s, we were expected to have them at the hospital. Dan was a marvelous child. He was 8 pounds, 6 ounces. He was perfect in every detail. He grew, he met all the growth spurt marks and everything. He was so smart. He walked at 9.5 months. And he got under, over, around, or through everything I put up to keep him safe. And by the time he was 10.5 or 11 months old, he came down with this dehydrating diarrhea flu sort of thing. He hurt so much he wanted to be held all the time, and he hurt so much he did not want to be touched. He followed me wherever I went, and he just rocked a little bit. He sat on the floor and just moved back and forth. And I fed him skim milk, which had been boiled and skimmed again for a week. We didn't know if we'd get to keep him. When he could keep 2 ounces of skimmed skim milk down and stretch out again, I put him into his crib to sleep. He'd just gone to sleep when my mom stopped by to check on us, and she asked how he was doing. And I said, well, I think the worst of the problem is over. Wasn't I really sick about this age? She said, well, yes, you were. We didn't know if we'd get to keep you. You seem to have the measles and the whooping cough all at the same time, high fever, red rash, and that terrible, terrible cough. It lasted about a week. And then the fever broke and the rash began to fade, and you could breathe without that terrible cough. So I put you in your crib and Susan in her bed, and I went across the hall to see if I could get a little rest myself. And in the middle of the night, I woke up. I sat up. I got up, and I went into your crib. And in the shadows on the other side of your crib, I saw a being so real, I reached out as if to touch that being. But instead, I reached down and scooped you up, stuck 2 fingers down your throat, pulled that phlegm out that was choking you, put you up on my shoulder and patted your back until you were breathing well again and sleeping. And then I looked up to see if I could still see that being, but it was gone. I knew right then I had just met your guardian angel, and I was not going to have to worry about you so much anymore. I thought again, wow. And then I asked, I said, a being in the shadows? And she said, no, it was not the angel of death. It was your guardian angel. There was so much joy and light in that room. I know it was your guardian angel. And I thought, well, Grandma Nellie, Cousin Lavona, Dr. Redfield playing music, Dr. Bergeson delivering me, Patricia Rose from my father, Patsy Rose from my daddy, life and life again from my mother, and a guardian angel. I had a pretty good first year. Now the years continued, and my boys, I had Chris 4 years after Dan. My boys were something like 4 and 8 when they found a butterfly in the meadow between our house and their school and brought it home. They wanted to see the butterfly. It was a caterpillar forming its chrysalis, and they brought that stem to me along with 3 of their little buddies and wondered what we should do. Well, I put it in a gallon pickle jar very carefully, poked holes in the lid so it would have some air, and talked to them about keeping it in the garage where it would undergo the same freeze and thaw cycles it might have met in the meadow. And we'd see what happened in the spring. In the spring, I took the garbage out and saw motion in that all but forgotten jar. So I took it out to the back steps and called my sons and their buddies, and we watched the butterfly emerge. It wasn't like the science books say, where a wet and woody looking thing crawls out and pumps fluid out into those wings. Instead, it seemed like all the beauty and wonder of that sunshiny back step came together and formed a beautiful golden butterfly. We took it carefully back to the meadow and let it go. Years later, 2 years later, as my father became terribly ill from Parkinson's, and my first husband and their father left us, we were trying to rethink how family works. And I wanted them to remember my father. Well, so I said, let me tell you some of the stories about how your nearly paralyzed and quiet grandfather was my laughing and singing dad. I taught them the songs my dad loved. Little Brown Jug, Man on the Flying Trapeze, and The Yellow Rose of Texas. And I told them how he could do a one-legged deep knee bend and how he could hang by his ankles and his heels from the same limb us kids played on. And I retold the story of the butterfly. Someday, I said, my dad would be free of his shrunken case to fly again among the light and love and sunshine. And my 11-year-old said, well, Mom, I think death is like another room, and while we're alive, we don't know how to get there, but when we die, we know the way. My 7-year-old said, maybe Grandpa will only get to be a mosquito. My dad had grown shrunken and twisted in that hard shell. And when he died, we took our own bouquet. We took 3 yellow roses, because yellow roses say goodbye. And we took tiny American flags that Chris had saved from the 4th of July, because he said, these will be for Grandpa's freedom. And we took a golden butterfly. Now, a few months after that, Mom and I came together to sort things out. We made places. This will be for Susan. This is for John. We did all of that around her living room. And then we sat down to go through some things because she was going to move to an apartment. And I had just moved to a much smaller house after finishing my master's degree. She as a widow, I as a divorcee, we were feeling a little bit left over. She slid a box over to me. She said, "These are your dad's things." And I thought, well, all right. Now, I'd been searching for my namesake because I hadn't found anyone else in those genealogies who was named Patricia. I hadn't had much luck so far, but when I started through Dad's box of things, I reached the place where there was a photograph upside down and crinkly, crackly, and it said Pat and Peggy, 1929. Now, I was born in 1940, and I thought, okay, here's my namesake. I told Mom, let's see now. These are Daddy's things, right? She said, yes. And Daddy named me, right? She said, yes. And for the 1000th time, she told that story about how, what a mistake he had made to name me anything that had anything whatsoever to do with patience, because I didn't have any. I said, all right, picked up that picture and turned it over. It's 2 old bulldogs. I remember my dad talking about Pat, his pet dog. And I remember most the day that lightning hit a tree in their pasture, and so all the kids went down to climb up in the tree, and Pat, that bulldog, ran right up that tree trunk with them. And Dad said they like to never got that dog back down again. And I laughed out loud to think this might be my namesake. I told Mom. She laughed too. And then she slid a suitcase full of yarn over to me. Now, in the bicentennial year, my children's Grandma May had offered to make each grandchild an Afghan in red, white, and blue. Not to be outdone, my mother offered to make each grandchild an Afghan in whatever colors they chose. Mom said she'd make one for the 7 of us too, but we were slower to specify colors and such. So she had this suitcase full of yarn left. And I said, Mom, I need to know leftovers are worth something. Make my Afghan. Use what you have. She went to work and crocheted this one over the next few weeks. She gave it to me. I think I wore it every night. And finally, I had worn it so much, I had to wash it. I threw it in the washing machine and the clothes dryer. And when it came out, well, not all of that yarn was the same kind. So some parts of it shrank up and twisted the Afghan. The Afghan isn't perfect, but neither was my mother. And neither am I. And neither are you. But it is warm and bright and lovely. And so was my mother. And so am I. And so are you, except, of course, for those of you who are warm and bright and handsome. These are some of the stories about my mom and dad. Okay, Megan, back to the slides. Next, what is a personal or family story? Well, in these that you just heard, those didn't come full-blown all at once. They came in bits and pieces. But you can see something happens in those stories. I was born. Something happens, my father died. Something happens, the butterfly changed. Something happens, I've washed that Afghan. There's a universal element present. We all have mothers and fathers. We might not all have Afghans, but they are awfully nice. We have emotions, we have experiences, and we have similar people. There's some universal elements in these stories. We give them a structure that will gather us up and carry us along so we know we're going somewhere, and will then leave us in a good place. Now, I just have to tell you this example. I was the second storyteller at a food co-op in St. Paul, and the first storyteller left us at her father's death at his graveside in tears. And then they said, and here's Pat. So I said, because I tell true stories, I had to stop seeing that guy I was meeting at his wife's new grave. The ground gets all packed down and hard after a while. And the crowd went wild, and now they were ready for one of my stories. It isn't always possible to land on a happy ending. Next slide. Where do you find these stories? Well, they're all around us. I was in the kitchen when the aunts and grandmas were telling those stories, and I sort of heard them, and I knew where to go to ask. Family, friends, and neighbors. I have new neighbors. They have 2 collies. They are the happiest dogs I've ever seen. There's stories there. You can look in baby books. I still have the baby books for my sons, and I put stories in them. In some families, you look in the Bible and they have listed the births and deaths. In my family, well, I'm one of 75 first cousins. There wasn't going to be room for all of that. So my grandmothers wrote in notebooks to keep all those names handy. Letters. In this year of isolation, I have found all those little pockets of letters that we put away to do something with someday and digitized them. Must have 500 digitized letters. We find them in scrapbooks and photo albums. In one of the scrapbooks, I took that tape from my first Steady's class ring, put that little wad of tape under it so the ring wouldn't fall off. Well, when we stopped going Steady a year later, I took that tape out and I put it in the scrapbook. And my sons discovered that and said, "Oh, look at that. Even our mom was just a silly 16-year-old. And the photo albums. Are you writing names and dates on yours? You think you'll remember, and you think people will remember, but they won't. Write the names and dates on them. In my family trees, I have found some interesting names. One is Sherebiah. This was a man, and his name means Song of the Lord. I'm still mining these little discoveries for the stories they hold. You'll find stories in moments and in mementos. My Aunt Sylvia, on her deathbed, gave me my first high school graduation gift. She gave me silver dollars. So Aunt Sylvia passing on silver on her deathbed. There are stories about deathbed gifts. And then I have those electronic and digital files. As my father approached death from Parkinson's in 1975, my big sister interviewed his brothers and sisters and cousins, and she wrote down all the memories, and she gathered up things like the Mother's Day card he'd made, and she put them all in a book. And I have that. I added an appendix, more photographs, and that 94-page booklet is now part of the State Historical Society of Iowa's archives because my dad was the quintessential Iowa farm boy in the 1900s, and my sister captured the stories and wrote them down. She did a great job. I made that 94-page book electronic, turned it into a digital file, but we really like the fact that it's print on paper at the archives. Next slide, Megan. Now, how can you best gather these? Sift them, sort them, and fine-tune the bits and pieces to make stories. Well, my very favorites, people have come to me and said, I wish I had a life as interesting as yours. I said, you do. You have a life just like that. Lift up your head and look around. I'm not the only one who's been stuck in the snowdrift. When you live alone, you know you have to do everything for yourself. So I shut these 3 fingers in the car door. And then, I had to open the car door, take the broken fingers out, get to the emergency room. I just held them up for my neighbor and said, and she took me to the emergency room. Eventually, they put a see in the dark, bright blue cast on this center finger that was the most badly broken. And I had to wear it for 6 weeks. Well, I'm working the public service desk at the public library, and the bright blue cast on that finger caused quite a bit of attention, and it became a story. People asked about it. You can ask people that you know about their stories, and then you can record them. Now, I tried recording stories from my mother. And the old-fashioned tape recorder, you know, where you push play and record at the same time and it goes ka-junk. That was difficult for them. And it just didn't work. So in 1993, when it was my turn to take my mother to the 4 family cemeteries for Decoration Day, remember, that was Memorial Day, I gave her a handheld voice-activated tape recorder. And I gave her a little wiggle room. I said, will you tell me some things about Dad's family? Now, my father's been dead for 10 years by then, so they aren't going to correct her. And so she began. You know, eventually she had a story for every tombstone. She told about Dad's family. She told about her own family. And pretty soon she was telling stories about the houses between the cemeteries, because some of those cemeteries began as that place up on the hill where we put Grandma and Grandpa. The last story she told was on our way back from Sheffield Cemetery, the last cemetery story. And she told about Great Uncle Ed, who was scalded to death when a steam engine exploded. I said, was it railroad accident? She said, I don't know. In the back seat is my new dad. My mother remarried 10 years after my father died. At the age of 73, she remarried, and Vern sang barbershop. So he sang the wreck of the old 97. They found him, his hand on the throttle and scalded to death by the steam. It was an amazing recording. I typed all of that up, gave it to my mother so she could read it over again. And now I am mining the stories she told. My great uncle Ed was scalded to death by the steam at the Christie coal mine south of Des Moines. And I found, when I looked it up, a 2-page newspaper spread giving all of the details, including the details about my great uncle Ed. I have that record in my mother's voice and those stories. I'm still looking for the documents to finish fleshing out some of those stories. And then here is my favorite: consider written treasures. What I did when one of my brothers said he had no happy memories of childhood, I said, I'll write down some of mine and send them to you, so they'll help you remember you have some of your own. And I began to write them down. Now, these became a way to mine the database and archives within each of us. And then we can search those newspapers, outside databases and archives for documentation to go with them. Next slide, please, Megan. These are samples from the treasures. I would write them down, just scattershot, didn't have to be organized in any way at all, because I had learned it's very difficult for some people. If I say, tell me a story, they're intimidated by that. But if I say, do you remember that washing machine we had out on the 40 acres? They can tell me their stories about that. Now, I just wrote these down scattershot. It's something made me think of this or that or the other thing. I wrote it down, and pretty soon I would have 5 or 6 of these little stories and memories, and I would send them off to my brother. And when I got to 50, I wrote and said, well, I guess this isn't helping much, and so I won't do it anymore. And he called and said, oh, Pat, when your letters come, we call a family meeting. We love the memories. Well, this would be the memories of that wringer washing machine and the first clothes dryer. And when I tipped that washing machine over, and when Mom was upset because it broke down finally, and Dad said it was a good thing and we wouldn't be replacing it. He said 15 loads a week. She could do them all at once at the laundromat and use the clothes dryers. You know, freeze drying worked, but it wasn't any fun. And while she was gone, she'd be visiting with her friends at the laundromat. It worked really well. Well, I just scattered these down, and finally I began to number them, and I put in a key word, wringer washer. I could have used laundry, and that would pick up even more, including the time I spent with that diaper pail, rinsing those diapers before they went in the laundry. So here's a sample. Sometimes the memory would be 8 words. Sometimes it would be 8 pages. They were not related to each other in any way, but I discovered when I used Word, it had a sort feature. So I had begun to number them just to separate them out a bit. Now I began to put that keyword in for sorting. Now all the stories about life on the 40 acres came together. All the stories about life on Creston in Des Moines came together. The stories about cars, teaching my sons to drive, those came together. The computer sorted them for me. You could do this on note cards. I'm an old librarian, and we certainly use those for sorting. But if you use Word and you say sort, and you've gone back and put the key words in, it's so much easier. Now, once you have captured these bits and pieces that your head is full of, you can begin to see some connections. Next slide, please, Megan. Mining the databases. Well, you begin to see the connections, and you can pick up on some perfectly stunning language. My great-great-grandfather on my father's side came to Story County right after the cholera pandemic of 1854. At that time, he and his family were living south of Chicago, and my great-great-grandfather was a self-taught physician. He'd been injured in a farming accident at the mill. They wanted to amputate his leg. He refused. He worked with that doctor for a year, kept his leg, but could no longer do that heavy work, and became more interested in the healing. He became a healer, and as he moved west with his family, when he reached south of Chicago in the cholera pandemic of 1854, it is said that of the 33 people who came to him, 28 lived. This was a fantastic number. And his sons could go out and coffin the dead without becoming ill because he understood sanitation and hydration. Coffin the dead. How many times have you read a history book that used a phrase like that? Wouldn't you like to see some of that? And then in Mom's transcript, there was the story of my grandfather who said he would never forget standing behind his mother at the screen door. And his mother saying, why, he'll kill that horse the way he's beating it. And my grandfather, as a little boy, said we knew how bad the news was by the way he beat the horse as he rode in to tell us. This is the story of the Christie coal mine steam engine explosion. It's 2 full pages in the newspaper, and it gives the early history of Des Moines, as well as the story of how my great uncle died. His lungs were so damaged with the hot steam. He wanted to talk to his brother before he died, and that's why the horseman was riding out to tell them that he died before his brother could get there. We knew how bad the news was by the way he beat the horse as he rode in to tell us. Early Des Moines history, family history. Then there's Dad said and Mom said. Well, they are telling you what they want you to learn and how they want you to be. Now, my dad taught me how to make gravy. I was 15. We were out on the 40 acres and there was running water in the house, but it was from a contaminated well. So we had to haul drinking water and cooking water for 9 people. My mother would take the empty cans and she'd go to her mom and dad's because they were sympathetic. It was Sunday. Dad and John and Tom were baling hay. I was supposed to get dinner on the table. Mom had gone in for water. I fried the 3 chickens in the 2 cast iron skillets. I fixed the mashed potatoes. I had the green beans. Everybody loves green beans. I had the biscuits. I had used the last of the water for iced tea. I had everything ready to put on the table, but Mom wasn't back yet. I didn't know how to make gravy, and I knew my dad could tell the time by where the sun was. So I went out and I waved him down. He pulled up beside me with that John Deere V, and he took the baler out of gear. Now, my brothers were thrilled by that because this was an awful, awful baler. You had to sit on either side and pass the wires through one at a time. In the meantime, the chaff and the dirt and insects living and dead and parts of field mice and parts of snakes were being flung out at you, and you were so sweaty. These things would just stick to you. My brother's eyebrows would stick out about ½ an inch when they came in from baling. They were thrilled the baler had stopped. Dad shut that tractor down, adjusted the choke, and said, I don't care if you know how to make gravy or not. We're going to finish this pass on the field and come in for dinner. You'll have gravy on the table. I said, yes, sir. Headed back to the house. I knew it had something to do with the fat and the chicken fryings and flour. I was pretty sure there was flour in it. I made gravy. Now, gravy, there were secret recipes. It was really a big thing to learn how to make gravy. I made gravy. Mom got back with the water. Dad and the boys came in, cleaned up. 9 people sat down for chicken dinner. 9 people ate my gravy on their mashed potatoes. 9 people cleaned their plates. Not one person complained. My brother told me 3 years later, that's how long it took before you could eat my gravy without using a knife and a fork. See, my father taught me more than how to make gravy that day. He taught me I don't have to stand around waiting for someone to tell me how to do things. I can pay attention, figure things out, and get things done. My mother said the same thing, but she said it a different way. She said, you never know what you can do until you have to. I said something similar. I think I said to my sons, you don't even have to get out of bed to die. As long as you're up, do something. And my sons and their families have been figuring things out and getting things done ever since. Dad said, Mom said, I'm sure your folks said things. Cat spit in the cookies. We had a cat that loved to lick the butter. And every time I tried to let the butter soften so I could make butter cookies, that cat would lick that butter up one side and down the other, and I'd have to throw it away because you can't put cat spit in the cookies. When I told that story to children, immediately hands went up. And children said, yes, you can. You just at our house, we just take a knife and we scrape off the lick marks. So I had to change that story because I listened back. And now when I told this story, I said, I had to throw the butter away because I can't put cat spit in the cookies. You do have to listen. And that is one of our family stories. There's another story about the watchdog. A man came into my house at midnight. He stepped over the sleeping watchdog. I heard him. He came out to ask what he was doing, standing in my living room near the dining room table. He said they said it was a greenhouse on the corner. He was drunk. I said, this one's white. He went back out, stepped over the still sleeping watchdog and went on his way. I called my son and told him what had happened. And Dan said, well, Mom, if he'd knocked, she would have barked. I called my son, Chris, and he said, Mom, lock the door, Mom. And there's another family story. It's about a moment in our lives that we were all remembering. Next slide, please. Here's the summary, and I guess it's just impossible not to say you can all do this. The hat, well, that might be the representation of a bit of a memory that you want to flesh out. And all the dots, those are helter-skelter, scattershot ideas, things that something that happened today reminded you of. It might be you saw a color and it reminded you of a certain thing. You took the car to the grocery store and that reminded you of something. You just put all these things down every which way in those treasures. And that's what I was doing. I have more than 250 of them now. The next slide, Megan, please. After a bit, you begin to see the connections among them. And so you begin to organize them with numbers. Now, it used to be we talked about outlining, but really it's not outlining. It's just capturing these memories and then seeing that, well, these are all about teaching those kids to drive. These are all about living on the 40 acres. And you begin to number them and group them, and they begin to fit together. Next slide. And so you connect the dots and the numbers, and look what you have. Well, it's an elephant because you might as well think big, but it has sharp corners. How do you smooth out those sharp corners? Well, maybe by now, you don't even want the hat. Maybe by now, your collection of memories has led you in a completely different direction. Whatever direction it led you in, it needs some smoothing out. And so here's what Sheila Daly Carroll told us to do to smooth out the rough edges. Next slide, Megan. Sheila Daly Carroll said a very long time ago at the Northland Storytelling Network conference, when you're developing a story, first you think it. Research goes here. I tell a story about my dad farming with mules. Now, I live in Waverly, Iowa. We have the largest draft horse sale in the world twice a year. They also sell mules and all of the tack you need for working animals. I knew if I were going to tell that story about my dad and the mules, I would need to do some research. I know the 7 commands a working animal has to know. Talk it. Well, I talked to the 6th grade about my dad and the mules, and they helped me out. I said, now, if these stories I'm telling you don't have anything to do with fire, because we were talking about prairie fires and such, you have to tell me so I can take them out. And they said, oh, Mrs. Coffie, we really, 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 really like the stories about the mules, but they're not about fire. You have to take them out. So I took them out and they became a story on their own. Then I began to tell that story about my dad and the mules and learn more things about what others thought and remembered and wondered about plowing with mules. I was listening back, smoothing things out. Friends will help you with that, although it's difficult to have an editor, because you go, what? I thought of that. What's wrong with saying that? Well, they will help you, and you do have to listen. And then you do some putting in, some taking out, and some rearranging. Instead of saying, you can't put cat spit in the cookies, I listened to the kids and I said, I can't put cat spit in the cookies. You go through this set of steps and you begin again and follow that set of steps until you're happy with the way the story tells. And then you can love it and tell it, and it will be yours to share. Now, I want to talk a little bit about sensitive stories because every family has some. If you did your total genealogy, that horse thief would be in there somewhere. Every family has stories that might be so sensitive, you are not going to put them out there on a commercial database. Rather, you might slip those into your collection of family stories. You could try fictionalizing those stories, but I did that with my Uncle Kenny and Aunt Helen. I gave them different names in the story, even though I have their permission to tell those stories. And after I finished, a gentleman came up to me and said, you're talking about Kenny Ballard. I went to high school with him. I'd know him anywhere. So I don't know how well that will work for you, but it is one way people have shared sensitive stories. I say, put them away. You don't have to tell everything you know. Next slide. I'm not going to tell you how to attach a document to each and every database because there are so many and they all have a process for you to use. But a story that you've digitized becomes as much of a document as the birth certificate or the death certificate and could just as well be attached. Next slide. This is the best, simplest, little bitty book that is still available. My copyrighted copy is from 1993. Donald Davis, he is a marvelous storyteller. And he is going to give you the hints for how to gather your own and put them together. For example, he will say what I had to learn the hard way. Don't expect people to drop everything and sit down and write the great American family history. That's too hard. Ask people, tell me about your first date. Here's how mine went. Or do you remember whether you took lunch or had a hot lunch? Do you recall the best teacher? The one you liked the best anyway. Different ways of getting people to open up. I did manage to say, tell me stories, anything you know about Dad's family. And that was good because they were all gone and Mom didn't have to worry about them correcting her. I did give her a piece of equipment that she was comfortable with. It was small, it was automatic. The tape didn't run the whole time. It only ran when she was talking. We spent that day at the 4 cemeteries, and when we got home, my mother would go to bed at 8:30 at night. She didn't care who was there. Company or no, at 8:30, she went to bed. When we got home after this whole day, walking through the graveyards, and at midnight, she was still up, sitting at the kitchen table, telling stories. Donald Davis's book will help you know how to help others feel that comfortable and share those stories with you. Last slide, or is this our last slide? Here's a little summary to help you. There's the elephant in the room. Scattershot. You have these memories and these experiences. Just write them down. Then give them a keyword and let them sort themselves out. Number them so you can begin to connect them. Connect the dots and then go through and smooth out the rough edges. You will have stories that you and others will love. Now, I don't think any of you know my mother and my dad, but I hope all of you know what warm and loving and fine people they were, because I added stories to the genealogy. Okay, Megan, do we have questions?
Let's see, nothing in the chat, but if anybody has any questions for Patricia, please feel free to unmute yourself or put them in the chat if you are more comfortable doing that.
And I want to thank Gwen, as she found some early letters written about my family. And I love that. Once you get started, you just find these bits and pieces everywhere. Behind me are the 2 charts I took to family reunions. One is about my mother and the pictures of my mother, and one is about my father and the pictures of my father, and the thing that ties them together are the pictures at the bottom of the 7 of us kids. Lots of ways to share these stories.
So we had a question asking if we could put up the genealogy slide, but you can actually access it on your own device or your own computer. So I'm just going to put another link to the slide deck in the chat so that everybody can get to that.
I've had a lot of fun with this, and I've learned the thing that you will learn. Not everyone who was there at the same time for the same event will remember it the same way. And what I did when I put a photographic book together of my large family, I finally, as a preface, said, this is my story of my family. If you want the story of your family written down, you should get started. Because we're different people. So we don't see things the same way. Now, if there's a really glaring error, you should fix that. But if it's just your emotions, it's your story. Go ahead and enjoy it. And I'm not worried about whether my sons want all of these things. As soon as people on both sides of my family learned that I was doing some of this, they started sending things to me. I have a lot. I have artifacts and stories and genealogies. It's wonderful stuff. I don't know what my sons will do with it, but my job isn't to decide what they do with their lives. It's to have some fun myself. And that's what these stories tell us. If we have another family reunion, we're going to suggest that everyone bring a story or two about family. Anybody else have family reunion stories? One year I arrived road blind, took my food in, put it on the table, didn't recognize anyone, but with a really large family, you don't always know who they are. And I thought they just brought some new ones in. And I got in line to go through and eat, and people chatted with me, and they finally asked me who I was. And I told them in which reunion I was coming to. I was at the wrong reunion. I went to the wrong shelter house. They were really nice to me, and they let me take my food and sent me over the hill to the right reunion. We have a lot of fun at those. Anyone have a question? If you get started and you want to ask about how to smooth out the rough edges, I'd be glad to help you. In Story City one year, a gentleman listened to my stories and then came to me and said, well, I have this story, but I just don't know how to end it. May I tell it to you? He told me the story. He said, this is a story about my mother. And he told me the story, but in the story, there were bits and pieces about his father, little adventures his father had had. So when he finished, he said, it just doesn't seem to end as well as yours do. I got one of this and two of those, and I got the climax and all that stuff. What am I doing wrong? And I said, well, maybe. You say this is about your mother, but you put in so many little things about your father. Maybe your father deserves his own story. So if you sort out the pieces, maybe the stories will come together better for you. The next year he came, he told me two stories. One was about his mother, one was about his father, and they came together really well for him. So if I can give you any sort of encouragement like that, send me an email, we'll talk. And one of these days, we'll do this live and in person again.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Patricia. You can find her email address on that slide deck. It's on both the first and last slides. And that link is in the chat, or it's also at amespubliclibrary.org/genealogy plus. Dick did share that he really enjoyed this and now understands how the stories fit into our genealogy and our research. So I think job done.
Okay, good. And it's fun because, you know, these were real people and it's fun to get to know them a little more.
Absolutely. All right. If there are no questions or further, so Gail just asked, can you tell a little bit about your Story County history?
Sure. My great-great-grandfather was Dr. Moses Russell Ballard. He first called himself doctor when he and the family reached Story County. And this is one of the lovely things I found. This is from the Story City Herald, Thursday, May 24th, 1923. Someone took the time to write down little stories of pioneer days. And my family, the Ballards, were pioneers in Story City, which was named Fairview when they first came. And my dad was fourth generation Story County. And we would go back. I was born and raised in Des Moines, but we would go back to Story County, where the house my grandfather built is still standing and still in use, and where all 9 of my grandmother's children were born, grandparents, my dad, his brothers and sisters, all were born in that house. And one of the Story County history folks took me for a drive and showed me all of those places. We would go back every summer and we'd go to the old home place, and my dad would open the gate and drive out in the pasture. Mom would have fixed a big picnic lunch. She'd lay that out for us. We would roll up our pants legs and wade in the Skunk River with my dad, where he showed us where he played in the Skunk River when he was a kid. Then we'd get out and pull the leeches off. I don't know why I would do that every year. And have dinner, and then Dad would take us to the Sheffield Cemetery. About half that place is my family. He would show us the boulder with the plaque that talks about the prairie fire where the Swearingen family was caught and died. And he would say he didn't think it was quite right. So later on, I researched that event. And my great-great-grandfather, being one of the few earliest physicians in the county, would have been there after that fire. My family was there by 1855. The fire was 1859-60. So I can tell those stories. I've done that research, and it all grew out of the fact that my dad was a Story County kid. He graduated from Story City High School in 1928, played football. I have those pictures thanks to my big sister, Susan. And we are thoroughly Story County, Iowa. You can still see what was the old home place from a truck stop on I-35.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions for Patricia before we end our session today?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. On that list of genealogy websites and so on, you have one called Chronicling America. I've never heard of that. What is that one?
I do not know what those are. When I was searching to say there are so many, I can't tell you how to attach a document to each and every one. I found that and I thought that was worth mention. 10 free sites that you can examine.
So I can tell you what Chronicling America is. I'll use my librarian skills.
Okay.
It is a newspaper source. So it is run by the Library of Congress, and they have digitized newspapers from communities across the country that you can access for free. They don't have all newspapers. There are a lot of resources out there to access free newspapers, and that's one of them. So
thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
I met another person who was looking to put stories with her family's genealogy because I was the librarian. She wanted to use the microphone reader printer and the mouse, and she didn't have a right hand. So I was moving the mouse to the left side so she could use it more easily. And she said, well, I just got tired of the family records that have just erased my brother. He's the reason I don't have this hand. I was 7 or 8 when he hurt my hand so much it had to be removed. And I'm just tired of people not talking about him as though he didn't ever exist. I understand he became an alcoholic and died and was buried in York County, and I want to find the records. Okay, that would be one of those sensitive stories. But they came up all the time, people just trying to fill out who they are, where they came from, and what their family was.
I just wanted to say that I've heard about this fire story before because Irene Jacobson, who is my husband's aunt, she wrote a story about that. And then she was told that it occurred on the land that was owned by the, it was Jacobson and the Wicks, I think. And no, maybe it was the Jacobsons. And so it was, you know, the actual fire took place, well, I mean, it was a prairie fire, but they found them there. I mean, they were told that they didn't live there in 1855, but they were told that by people that had lived there at that time.
The Swearingen family was on its way from Nevada to Fort Dodge, where they had claimed land.
It's in Milford Township.
Yeah, and they were using what was, I believe, called the Fort Dodge Road when they were caught in the fire. I can tell one history of Iowa, takes an hour and a half, in family and fire. There are 7 fires, and that's one of them. I have found the eyewitness reports of that fire.
Oh, I'd love to have those if you have them.
And it's the prairie fire. My youngest brother burned our barn down. That would be the family farm. And then I set fire to the apartment. It would be Tallgrass Prairie, family farm, big city, right?
Mm-hmm.
Once you get started in these, and you know, the 4 stories I told as one were all separate events. They weren't just automatically connected. That took some years. And the fire stories have also taken years because they were all told as separate events. But one day I went, wow, this is one story of Iowa in family and fire.
Yep.
I bet you'll find
I have
something like that too. Yes.
I have an interesting affirmation to what you're talking about. I know that you said, you know, you can get information from reunions. And we went to a reunion and this family said, I have these letters, but we're just questioning whether to throw them away because they're written in German and none of us read and understand German. So my husband took them home and checked with the German department here. They said, we can't read them, but we think this 80-year-old woman can read them because it's an old form of German.
Yeah.
And so we took them to her and she started reading. She translated them for us. And then she said, so my husband said, oh, well, that's just news, just general news. Well, I guess the point of my story is that it wasn't just general news. I started looking at it and I could build a family tree because they would say, your brother in a certain town in Germany, we're going to go see him tomorrow. And then you could say, and my sister over here is sick. And my aunt is doing this and this. And we're thinking, oh my gosh, but my husband thought it was just news. So sometimes your stories can help with your family trees. That's my only comment.
Yes, they can. They can. And they make, for me, they make those people live again.
Yes.
There's a little joke. Someone said to the witch, can you make him alive again? And the witch said, no, I don't have that power. Can you tell me a story about it? The person said, yes. Will that make him alive again? And the witch said, for a while.
Yeah, that's right.
In the memories. Yeah. And I've found little bits and pieces that I haven't slotted into one of these stories. My grandmother, who had her 9 children at home in the house my grandfather built in Story County, could also drive a 4-mule hitch to help with the harvest. Don't you love it? Don't you wish you were your grandma? And there are family reunion and gravy stories. At Grandma Ballard's, you use the flour sifter, but you only shook it. You didn't use that little handle.
Right.
You only shook it because what you were doing was sifting out the bugs and the weevils and throwing those away. And then you made the gravy. And I live. See? You bought a whole lot of stuff at once and you were glad you had it and you didn't waste it. A lot of these stories are just great fun. And then there are some that just make your heart ache. And that's family.
I found out not so long ago that my husband's family was in St. Cloud, Minnesota at the time of, I think it was 1886 or something like that, tornado. And I'd been married for over 60 years and I'd never heard about any of this. And he lost 3 of the children were killed in the tornado. The house was damaged. The father was injured and died 3 years later. Although I don't know this, I'm inferring that it was probably from some of the injuries in the tornado. And mom, the mother of the family, and there were 14 children, was out of town. And she must have been out of town with the baby because the youngest was so young at the time. I can't imagine that she left, and I don't know where she went. And I said to one of the cousins, I said, I never knew anything about this. Oh yeah, there was a tornado. I'm going, yeah, there was a tornado. And so I'm still working on that one.
Yep, you get little bits and pieces, and this is what I call mining the memories. You start looking for the documents that go with those. And I have some that are perfectly wonderful. So, and I tell the story of going out to check on great grandma. She broke her hip, and us 2 of her grandsons and their wives, I'm one of the wives, decided we'd go out and check on her. I left my sons with their grandma. Rich and Barb brought their baby with them. He was breastfed, seemed like it could work, and we're going to drive straight through 14 hours because we've got 4 drivers, and when you're not driving, you can sleep. Well, Barb summed up our trip this way. She said, I woke up when the baby flew out of my arms and hit the door on the other side of the car. But Pat woke up first, and that's good because she was driving. Story in a nutshell. I could not have come up with that, but isn't it beautiful? Isn't it fun to find some of these things? Coffin the dead. These terms that just draw you in. I hope you find some of these things too.
Well, wonderful.
Sure.
Thank you. Oh, please go ahead.
Patricia,
Yes.
have you ever found any connection with you or your family with the children's blizzard of 1888 that went through North and South Dakota and Minnesota?
I haven't seen that. No, I haven't seen the connection there.
I have the
Yeah.
book on that. It's very, very interesting.
isn't it fun to go back and read those things when you know at least some of the people or one of the people, or you're exploring the connections?
Is that the one called The Children's Blizzard?
Yes.
Okay, my husband's grandfather was a 17-year-old living in North Dakota at the time. And he was on his way back from school when the blizzard hit. And he was going to school because he'd come from Norway and he was trying to learn English better. And so he found his way to an implement dealer or a farm shop of some kind and sheltered there. So he was okay. And that's all that the family has ever said about that. I'm going, where are you guys?
Yeah.
But it is a very, very powerful story. And I've got the book.
All right. Well, we have versions of some of the stories, and it's all right with me if we talk about the facts. But when you try to correct my memories, I go, wait a minute. That's not how I saw it. So there's some stories I do try to get permission to tell them, and love the stories I've heard. Now, we went to my grandma Anna. She's the one that could drive the 4-mule hitch, and she has a brother, Will, and 3 sisters. And the way my mother told it, and these are the descriptions I use, she said, you know, Rose was always a lady. And Will was a lovely person. But Laura and Leona, they were something else. When we went to that family reunion, Laura and Leona went hiking down the highway to the nearest bar. No one else would go with them. And when they got back, the next morning, they climbed up on the picnic table. My mother is fixing breakfast for us over here. Laura and Leona got up on top of the picnic table. I was a kid. I thought they were dancing. No, they were having a contest that had something to do with passing gas. And my mother's face is the perfect face for, oh my God, that's the other side of the family. That's Rose and Laura and Leona. So I do hope you're finding bits and pieces that you can put together with those people, and that some of them spin out into actual stories that take us along with you for a while and let us get to know some of your family members a little better.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Thanks so much, Patricia.
Sure.
All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today for Genealogy Plus. We will see you in a few months as we take a brief summer hiatus from our Genealogy Plus programming. So I'll look forward to seeing you all then.
Thank you,
Thank
Megan,
you.
for your wonderful work with the tech.
You're welcome.
Sorry it didn't work so well for me.
No need to apologize. That's what I'm here for.
All right.
Thank you.
I thank both of you.